Welcome to the 2023 Social Justice and Education Award Lecture. My name is Jamel K. Donner. I am the Fred Hubie Memorial Professor of Education in the School of Education at William & Mary and past chair of the Social Justice Action Committee for AERA. It is my extreme honor to introduce the 2023 Social Justice and Education Award Lecturer, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill. I first met Dr. Hill when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Washington University in St. Louis in 2005. And over the course of that time, I have watched Dr. Hill distinguish himself as an academic, a social justice and cultural critic, a media personality, and an activist. Dr. Hill is a prolific scholar who has published 8 books, 2 edited books, 3 edited journals, 18 journal articles, and 10 book chapters, which is a career for many academics. That said, Dr. Hill continues to be a productive academic scholar, as evidenced by his recent book, Seen and Unseen: Technology, Social Media, and the Fight for Racial Justice. While Dr. Hill's scholarship alone more than makes him qualified for the 2023 Social Justice and Education Award, I would be remiss if I did not discuss his engagement and contributions to the city of Philadelphia, which includes his bookstore, Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books, located in the heart of the Germantown section of Philadelphia, which, in addition to promoting Black authors and authors of color in general, Uncle Bobby's was created to provide underserved communities with access to books and a space where everyone feels valued. Also, Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books is a community space that holds free author talks and dozens of other events, including weekly story time for kids and back-to-school drives. As an aside, Dr. Hill also owns a community space adjacent to Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books, where he conducts workshops on social justice-related topics such as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, respectively. Dr. Hill has also created a literacy project that uses hip-hop culture to increase school engagement and reading skills among high school students, as well as organize and teach adult literacy courses for high school dropouts in Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey. That said, I do not think it's a stretch to say that Dr. Marc Lamont Hill is the intellectual forerunner to an entire genre of hip-hop in education scholarship, as evidenced by his 2007 co-edited book, Media, Learning, and Sites of Possibilities, his 2009 book, Beats, Rhymes, and Classroom Life, Hip-Hop Pedagogy and the Politics of Identity, and his 2013 co-edited book, Schooling Hip-Hop: Expanding Hip-Hop-Based Education Across the Curriculum. In addition, Dr. Hill has also worked with the ACLU's Drug Reform Project, focusing on drug enforcement policy. Lastly, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill has also worked as a political contributor and commentator for several mainstream news and information outlets such as Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and Court TV. In addition, Dr. Hill has hosted several television shows, including One World with Black Enterprise, HuffPost Live, Up Front on Al Jazeera, and anchored Black News Tonight, a primetime news show on the Black News Channel. And most recently, he was featured prominently as a contributor in the Freaknik documentary, currently on Hulu. As I hope you are able to glean from my remarks, the thread weaving all of Dr. Marc Lamont Hill's activities is social justice. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you Dr. Marc Lamont Hill.
Good evening, everybody. Oh my God, that was such a wonderful introduction by my dear colleague, friend, and frat brother, Dr. Jamel Donna, and only a Kappa would bring up Freaknik in the middle of AERA. It is an honor to be here. I don't really win awards. Honestly, I don't think I've ever won one in the Academy, and this was my first one. And for it to be the Social Justice Award meant and means so much to me. So I want to thank the committee, the people who nominated me, and all the people who made this happen. And as most things are in our world, especially the Black world, the victories only come through struggle. And so even this award is a product of collective organizing and struggle and love, and I'm grateful to all of you for that, so thank you. I'm also, thank you, please thank the committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all tonight about social justice. And I don't normally bring notes, I usually do it from the top of my head. Last time I wrote a speech down was when I spoke at the United Nations. so watch out now. But before I give my remarks, which deal with this issue of schooling in the age of incarceration, it would be irresponsible for me at an educational conference not to acknowledge the students and the teachers and the administrators, the intellectuals who have been victims of the genocide in Gaza. We have to be honest about that. At this moment, every single university in the Gaza Strip has been destroyed. Over 300 schools, elementary and secondary, have been destroyed. Our colleagues, our friends and brothers and comrades in intellectual work and in political struggle have been targeted and assassinated. And there's no end in sight. And as an educational organization, we have a responsibility to speak the truth, to boycott, to divest, and to sanction. And to this moment, we have done none of those things. And so, in what will likely be my last award speech at this esteemed institution, I want to talk about the age of incarceration. And I begin with the words of one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, perhaps the 19th century. The jail you plan for me is the one you gonna rot in. We are living in the age of incarceration. Over the past 50 years, the prison population in the United States has grown from 250,000 to more than 2 million people. This means that more than 1 in 100 American adults is currently incarcerated in prisons and jails. Another 4.5 million, that's 1 in 50 adults, stands at the doorstep of the prison through parole or probation. When you put these numbers in an international context, they become even more jarring. This country accounts for more than 24% of the world's prison population, despite comprising only 5% of the global population. As a nation, the US incarcerates more citizens in China, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, Venezuela, China, all the countries that we castigate and demonize that George Bush used to call the axis of evil. We find a way to lock up more people than all of them. We currently cage more of our citizens in all of the first world nations. You take England, you take France, you take Canada, for example. You combine them, we got more. Now, the current carceral crisis is often defined by the practice of mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is a provocative term because it implies wrongly that all members of our society are being incarcerated at similar rates. But this is not the case. This is far from the case. A careful look at exactly who comprises the incarcerated majority tells a tale that is both revealing and alarming. One in 15 black males and 1 in 26 Latinx males are currently incarcerated. 1 in 3 African-American males and 1 in 5 Latinx males between 20 and 29 are on parole, probation, or incarcerated. And of course, women comprise the fastest growing segment of the prison population, increasing at twice the rate of men over the last 25 years. Now, this is not mass incarceration. This is mass incarceration of the vulnerable. Now, as these numbers continue to swell, the conditions inside of prisons continue to get worse. While the original American idea of the penitentiary was rooted both etymologically and ideologically in the idea of penitence, the belief that time, reflection, and education would allow us to return to society as remade and redeemed citizens, the modern prison has been emptied of any rehabilitative capacity. Access to reading materials, affordable phone calls to family, college degree programs, and mental health resources, all of which are proven to reduce recidivism, they've all been stripped from many American prisons. Given these realities, it is no surprise that some studies show that incarceration increases the likelihood that an individual will commit another crime. I'm gonna say that again. Being incarcerated increases the likelihood that you will commit another criminal act, making the prison a criminogenic holding pen rather than a site of rehabilitation. But the stakes of mass incarceration are not limited to the time that we spend in prison. As scholars have demonstrated, criminal convictions often result in the denial of access to all the benefits of democratic citizenship, employment, housing, education, voting rights. And beyond juridical forms of citizenship, the shame and stigma of being a criminal or an ex-con follow the formerly incarcerated throughout everyday life in perpetuity. The prison has become a pathway to permanent second-class citizenship, where individuals are forever defined both legally and socially by what they did rather than who they are. But I'm going somewhere else today, because y'all can read that stuff somewhere else. You can get a sociologist to tell you that, God forbid. My wife's a sociologist. She's over there. I got to tease her. The age of incarceration not only refers to the astronomical number of humans living under criminal supervision, but also a deeper crisis of moral and political imagination. Our collective vision of justice is nearly always linked to punishment. Our collective vision of punishment is inextricably linked to confinement. Our very conception of civil society, our very idea of democracy, of peace, of freedom, they all hinge upon the existence of a caged class. The prison and its apparatuses loom so large that we can't see beyond them. Indeed, it is easier for some of us to imagine the end of the world itself than to envision a world without prisons. This crisis of imagination isn't just operating in the abstract, though. Our inability to think outside the prison is reflected in our social policies and our practices. From the rise of surveillance culture to the expansion of the carceral state, we have entered a moment in which the punishment industry has become the refuge for the nation's social, medical, and economic contradictions. Crises like homelessness and poverty and drug addiction and mental illness, they are now addressed directly or indirectly by caging the people inside of them. Crime has become a dangerous yet convenient scapegoat for the failures of the American democratic experiment. The prison has become a catch-all for the contradictions of white supremacist patriarchal capitalist empire, to quote the great Bell Hooks, may she rest in peace. To end the age of incarceration, we got to begin to think and act against the prison. We must strip profit motives from carceral institutions, both private and public, so that no person and no community's economic destiny is tied to human confinement. In the purest sense of the radical tradition, we must begin to address the root causes of our social problems. Why are people addicted to drugs? Why are people unhoused? Why are children dropping out of school? We must then address these crises in ways that are restorative rather than retributive. Instead of asking who did something wrong and how do we punish them, we must instead determine who was harmed and how can we make them whole again. Justice requires that we discover methods of repair and healing rather than blame and punishment. Now, this path to realizing restorative ideals is directly tied to the work of schools. Like virtually every sector of public life, contemporary schooling in the United States has been besieged by the forces of neoliberal privatization and neo-fascist authoritarianism. Schooling processes are increasingly understood as business transactions and techniques of state power rather than liberatory projects or intellectual engagements. The value of a school, a teacher, a student, an administrator, a curriculum, or a pedagogical practice is measured largely, if not exclusively, by their correlations to high-stakes test scores and corporate profit margins. Students' educational lives are increasingly controlled by draconian disciplinary policies, by vast surveillance, and by deep militarization, all of which tether them more tightly to an ever-expanding and increasingly profit-driven punishment state. As a consequence of these conditions, our most vulnerable communities have been rendered disposable by the very institutions that are designed to protect them. Instead of training grounds for democracy, as John Dewey imagined, too many of our schools have become little more than staging areas for the prison. So the question is, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? In our new... Let me take a step back. Let's look back to 1993. There's a book that came out in 1993. It's now a classic by Mary Rose O'Reilly called The Peaceable Classroom, The Peaceable Classroom. And in that book, she asked the question, is it possible to teach English so that people stop killing each other? O'Reilly had been haunted by this question since she first heard it raised by an Egyptian postmodern literary theorist named Ihab Hassan in 1967 during the height of the Vietnam War. The question wasn't just an urgent call for peace, it was a powerful provocation to teachers and to scholars for whom many of us, theory has let us off the hook. In response, O'Reilly produced a text that dared teachers to imagine a classroom that both recognized and spoke back to the suffering of the outside world. She offered both an alternative vision and a corrective practice. And that's what I'm going to do with y'all tonight. I'm raising a similarly audacious inquiry. I'm asking, how can we imagine school in ways that stop us from caging each other? From the building architecture to the official curriculum to the disciplinary practices, how can we create schooling environments that not only reduce the need for prisons, but also give us permission to believe that prisons are not needed? Unlike O'Reilly, though, I don't begin with the entirely reasonable question of, is it possible? No, I begin from a place of reckless and wholly unreasonable faith in the idea that other schools, other systems, other selves, other lives, other worlds are indeed possible. Now, I use those words reckless and unreasonable quite soberly and quite deliberately to describe my belief in schooling against the prison. I use this language because at this juncture in history, there is plentiful evidence that strikes against such an ambitious freedom dream. The growing gap between the privileged and the poor in every sector of social life gives us little empirical reason to believe in a world that is not yet. Western academic theories of power, which suggest that relations of domination will be merely rearranged rather than destroyed, they give us no intellectual motivation to imagine more robust forms of freedom. At a moment where state violence is justified and black, brown, queer, and trans death is normalized and the prison is naturalized, we have little incentive to believe that a different social landscape is on the horizon. The odds and the evidence are against us. Freedom is always unreasonable within the logic of oppression. But like every successful freedom fighter before us, we must recklessly pursue the unreasonable until the unreasonable becomes inevitable. We must remain captive to hope. So what I want to do in a little bit of time that I got is talk a little bit about what that might look like. Give me 1 second, my pages got flipped. When we walk into a school inside of Philadelphia or New Orleans or Detroit or Chicago, there's some noticeable similarities in all of these schools. You see a line of kids waiting to get in. And every single year, the line gets longer and the rituals get more complicated. You get through the door and there's a metal detector scanning you. You got police officers, you got parole officers, you got probation officers, you got dogs sniffing. You got all of this technology, all of this infrastructure, all of this human capital deployed at the front of the school to create a certain kind of barrier of entry. That's relatively new. The construction of these spaces is fascinating because it reflects a growing commitment to a pedagogy of criminalization within our schools. And when I say a pedagogy of criminalization, I'm referring to the idea that schools begin from a place of presuming criminality within students, and their primary response to all forms of harm, all forms of contradiction, all forms of injustice, all forms of disagreement, all forms of discord is through the logic of criminalization. And then when you get into the school, after all that criminalization, after all that searching, after all them dogs, after all them police, ain't nobody stopping you from leaving. That articulates a pedagogy of expectation for what the school building is supposed to do, for what the school building is supposed to be. I'm so glad I don't normally give speeches. I've been trying my best to find these pages, but you know what? I'm gonna let them use me. The pedagogy of criminalization eyes the challenges and contradictions of our society through the lens of discipline, surveillance, isolation, punishment, and exclusion. The pedagogy of criminalization prioritizes rigid and universal reactions to harm over community-driven and context-specific responses. The pedagogy of criminalization empowers the state, and specifically the criminal legal system, to adjudicate all forms of harm, misconduct, and socially undesirable choices. The pedagogy of criminalization endorses reactionary policies rather than embracing root-based solutions. The pedagogy of criminalization reinforces the myth that the prison is necessary, valuable, and immovable. This is the pedagogy of criminalization, and it's written into a broader social contract. The pedagogy of criminalization is not exclusive to schools. In every sector of society, we have increasingly relied upon the prison as the response to our social challenges. Drug addiction has been treated as a criminal offense rather than a medical problem. Homelessness has been dealt with through punitive policies that effectively banish unhoused people from the public sphere. Every day, untrained police are called to engage people struggling with mental illnesses, which often leads to violent interactions and criminal prosecution. Criminalization has allowed us to scapegoat the vulnerable for the failures of our democracy and the flaws in our social contract. Within schools, the pedagogy of criminalization informs every aspect of institutional culture, from building security to classroom discipline. Our schools have embraced carceral logics that undermine the abolitionist values of peace, restoration, safety, and justice. They also undermine the ostensible mission of schools, which is to produce what? A well-educated and critically informed citizenry. By adopting pedagogies of criminalization within our schools, we dramatically increase the chances that our students will be delivered to the prison. Most certainly, we produce future students for whom the inhumane and death-dealing dimensions of the prison will be deemed natural, reasonable, and unchangeable. As we begin to use the logics of carcerality, we don't prevent incarceration, we expand incarceration. As Ms. Seeley said, the jail you plan for me is the one you gonna rot in. We understand that crime is a social construct. People don't commit crimes, people commit acts. Societies then criminalize those acts. Society's definition of crime depends on the historical moment, the geographic location, the political disposition of the dominant class. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a black person escaping enslavement or anybody who aided them was committing a crime and acting as an enemy of the state. In the early to mid 20th century, a marijuana smoker was both a criminal and a social deviant. Some of y'all, times done changed. Today, as our society generally regards slaveholding as a moral atrocity and increasingly considers marijuana no more than a harmless vice, it is difficult, if not impossible, to sustain those same negative judgments against the people who committed such crimes. I'm going to fast forward a bit because I want to take this to a different context. Part of what criminalization is about is not the acts we commit, but who we decide to look for those acts. Criminalization is the primary reason that the American prison population has grown tenfold since the mid-20th century. We did not create a generation of criminals. We did not create a generation of slow runners, folk we just can't get away from the police like we used to. We created a generation of people who have been increasingly criminalized. I'll give you an example. The original federal criminal code created in 1790 had 30 crimes in it. 30. The current federal code includes more than 5,000 federal statutes and 300,000 penalties that carry criminal penalties. Harry Silvergate estimates that the average American commits, mostly unintentionally, 3 felonies a day. But we ain't looking for all of y'all. If I were to go up the street to that lesser institution, I ain't say which one. How many arrests for public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, possession of marijuana could be made? If I went to the elite boarding school on the other side of town, or a private liberal arts college on a Friday night, I could find the very same things that they look for in Richard Allen projects back in the day, that they look for in Kensington right now, that they look for in what they call the Badlands right now. But we ain't looking there. When you look for crimes, you find them. Why does this matter for schools? Well, if you look at the School District of Philadelphia's disciplinary handbook, as Dakota Irby did in his dissertation many years ago, what do you find? You find school codes of conduct that were 10 pages long, 15 pages long, 20 pages long. You go to any high school in Philadelphia right now. You go to West Philly, go to Overbrook, where all the legends come from. Wilt Chamberlain, Will Smith, and Gloria Ladson-Billings. And after the Oscars, Gloria moving up on the list. The school codes of conduct are 100 pages now. They're 112 pages now. Just like outside of society, when we have widened the net of criminality, we have widened the net of criminality in school. You can get in trouble for more stuff, but we did something else in our society. We didn't just widen the net of criminality. As Dakota Irby said, we also deepened the net of criminality. So not only do you get in trouble for more stuff, but the penalties are greater. Back when Kamika Royal, who now is an AERA award-winning book author, she got the book of the year. But before that, she was at the second best high school in Philadelphia, Central High School, and when she got in trouble, they gave her a pink slip. You got a pink slip. You got in trouble. You got sent to the dean's office. The dean was often just the vice principal who they were underusing and de-skilling by not making them do intellectual work, but simply having them do disciplinary labor. But they had them in there. You get a pink slip, they call your mom and them, you go back. Now those very same schools, not only can you be given a pink slip or some disciplinary act within the school, but you also can get arrested by the armed school resource officer that's in the building. Now, when you write Melissa loves Marc on the wall with your permanent marker, you're not just violating the code of conduct of the school, you're also violating the gang graffiti code. You can be expelled from school. A 6-year-old girl was carried out in handcuffs. You're gonna be shocked to know it was in Florida. Because she had a temper tantrum and yelled. They arrested her for disorderly conduct. Now that should have been a call to her mama and them. Should have been a timeout. Is it appropriate behavior? No. Is it developmentally appropriate behavior? Absolutely. But we criminalize black children for developmentally appropriate behavior because we cannot see them as children. As Margaret Beale Spencer used to say, we see them as short adults. We adultify them in such a way that we criminalize them from day one. This is the pedagogy of criminalization against black children. But I'm gonna not just talk about that case. I'm gonna say 2 more things and I'm gonna leave y'all alone. It's not just against the children that we criminalize, although we have to recognize the criminalization of these children because it doesn't happen from pure objective contradictions of the school code. Let me put it differently. If you walk into a classroom and punch the teacher in the face, or you smoke crack in the back of the lunchroom, we probably will all agree that that's a violation of school policy, just about any school in America. But that's not what we get suspended for. 80% of suspensions and expulsions don't come from concrete, objective violations of school policy. They come from what are known as disciplinary moments. The disciplinary moment is when the educator has to make a subjective interpretation of your behavior. They have to decide if you're being disrespectful. They have to decide if you're being aggressive. They have to decide if you're disengaged. And the problem is we smuggle into the classroom the very same biases, the very same stereotypes, the very same lies about our humanity that the rest of the world does. And so in the same way that George Zimmerman may have really thought Trayvon Martin was violent with his hoodie and his Arizona iced tea, the same way Darren Wilson may have legitimately seen Mike Brown walking down the street and really thought, as he said to the grand jury, that he could walk through bullets. The fight isn't whether or not these people are telling the truth or whether they're lying. It'd be actually more comforting if they were lying, because then they would be the outlier white supremacists. The more scary part is that these people actually legitimately see black bodies as violent inherently and natural. And what we've done through the law and now through school discipline policy is codify irrational white supremacist anxieties and fears about black people and trans people and brown people and disabled people. Wow. But let me go somewhere else real quick before I leave y'all alone. I'm gonna read something to you. It's an announcement that came on January 3rd, 2011. We are putting parents on notice. If you fail in your responsibility to your kids, we are going to work to make sure you face the full force and consequences of the law. That's heavy, right? Those words were uttered by the newly elected California Attorney General. I think you may have heard of her, Kamala Harris. After winning the previous November election, Harris was inaugurated as the first black, first South Asian American, and first woman Attorney General in California state history. In her first day as the top cop, she did some interesting things, right? She described truancy as a crisis. She cited the 600,000 truant students in the state's elementary schools. She said that the truant students roughly matches the number of people incarcerated in California state prisons. Is it a coincidence? She said no, of course not. Now, this isn't inherently problematic. She's trying to draw a linkage between the social outcomes people have and people's failure to access school, and maybe there's something we can do to get people into school. That ain't the problem. The problem is that her diagnosis was betrayed by the cure. Rather than targeting the factors that lead to truancy, Harris proposed to replicate the strategy she deployed as district attorney of San Francisco, where her office, quote, threatened the parents of truants with prosecution. She pronounced her intention to crack down on truancy by enforcing California Penal Code 270.1, which is the Get Tough legislation enforced and signed by Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. The law dictated that any student who was absent from school without a valid excuse for 10% or more of the school days in one school year from the date of enrollment to the current date is a chronic truant. And for parents, if their kid is a chronic truant, they can get $2,000 in fines and up to 1 year in jail. So our attorney general at the time promised to save students by punishing parents. This, again, becomes a logic of criminalization, but it also enforces something else that I'm going to talk about in a second. April 18th, 2013, her word became bond. Dozens of photographers were gathered outside of the Orange County, California home of Cherie Peoples, a black mother and her 11-year-old daughter, Shayla. They were there to capture the scene as two police officers entered the house and walked Peoples, who was dressed in pajamas, restrained by handcuffs, into an awaiting patrol car. Shayla suffered from sickle cell anemia. She'd missed 20 days in school, which, according to the new law, placed her in violation of the state's new law. Peoples argued that her daughter's medical condition was the reason for her absences. The debilitating pain and the frequent hospitalization that comes with sickle cell said she needed additional allowances from the school. They decided not to do so. But what they did tell her is they would drop the charges if she agreed to attend parenting classes so that she could be a better parent. She refused, saying she was innocent. And so they continued her prosecution. There are many cases like this, and these cases reflect a shift in the focus of truancy laws. They were created out of concern for parents and families, the well-being of them, but they were undergirded by, these current laws, however, are undergirded by a logic of criminalization. They believe truancy is an index of our social decay. Truant students are no longer viewed as vulnerable children losing educational opportunities, but as human embodiments of broken windows theory, whose absence from school signifies community disorder and looming unsafety for the broader society. Within this framework, parents are understood as failures not only to their own children, but to a society left to cope with their future crimes and their inevitable incarceration. I want you to keep in mind this woman who got locked up and her child. Just keep that on the sticky side of your brain for like 2 minutes. I'm gonna come back to it, but just watch what I do with this because it's very, very important. These actions are part of a pedagogy of blame that shapes educational policy and practice. It's the practice of scapegoating particular individuals and groups for their undesirable experiences, conditions, and outcomes. It's a form of governmentality that enables the state, through apparatuses like media, law, religion, and pop culture, to justify structural inequality and to deny culpability for various forms of state violence and absolve itself of the responsibility to defend, protect, and invest in its most vulnerable individuals and communities. It's an outgrowth of neoliberalism. I wrote a book on this. It's coming out next year. Y'all can read it. We'll go into greater detail later because we ain't got a lot of time. But what I want you to understand from this pedagogy of blame is that it only gets deployed against certain kinds of folk. But it's also something that gets enforced in schools in ways that sometimes undermine our liberal abolitionist principles. In other words, a whole lot of us say we want cops out of schools and we want social workers in schools. But it's oftentimes those social workers who end up being proxies for the police when they have to make the call to decide whether or not a child is being well treated or mistreated. 1 in 3 children in America of all races, I'm gonna say it again, 1 in 3 children in America are the targets of an investigation for child neglect. 1 in 3. And of black children, for black children, 56%. So it's not enough to just say we want police out of schools. We have to get rid of the logic of policing. But we also have to create such contexts and situations, as Dorothy Roberts teaches us, so that we can actually repair the damage that's done in school. In other words, if a kid is missing 20 days of school, what intervention do we have in response to that? If a kid looks like they're not taken care of, which is usually has nothing to do with parenting and all to do with poverty, what kind of economic intervention can we make to repair the harm that's being caused in our school districts and in our educational communities, rather than simply taking the child from the parent and putting them in a foster care system, which increases their likelihood of being incarcerated, which increases their likelihood of having encounters with the criminal legal system, which increases their chances of not finishing high school, which increases their chances of committing suicide, of getting pregnant before 18, of getting HIV/AIDS. Every measure of social misery, of social decay that the right likes to throw on it, the solutions they offer reinforce those very things. So we have to think about that. But I'm gonna give y'all another story real quick, and then I promise I'm done. I appreciate y'all, but I want to do some Q&A. In the summer of 2021, a magazine published an article called "Understanding and Addressing School Refusal." The magazine was called Independent School. Some of y'all probably read it or read it. The article was penned by a man named Theo Stripling. He's a high school counselor at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools. And he was addressing the rise of students who demonstrated the traits of school refusal, which he defined as, quote, emotional distress or anxiety on the refusal to attend school. He was pointing to the unusual burdens that were placed on the Chicago Lab School students during the previous year, when the COVID-19 pandemic forced the school to close its building and move all activities online. Stripling and his colleagues identified 8 students who demonstrated the characteristics of school refusal. I'm gonna read the definition of school refusal one more time. Emotional distress or anxiety centered on the refusal to attend school. That sounds like a fancy, academic, clinical definition of truancy. But look at where school refusal gets used. After identifying the students who were engaged in school refusal, a 16-person learning and counseling team comprised of school counselors, college counselors, learning coordinators, they all met with the school's administration and the school nurse. And through this, what they call teaming structure, the school community assessed each student's academic and medical needs. These assessments provided the foundation for a range of intervention processes that included teachers. It also included members of the school community. It also included healthcare providers and the parents. From this place, the school, the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, were able to address the root causes of student disengagement and to locate sustainable context-specific solutions. UCL, I ain't said nothing, I'm just reading. UCLS's approach is neither rare nor exceptional. Around the country, numerous educational institutions respond to school refusal and other challenges by investing in a range of social, medical, and academic resources. At times, the responses are motivated by humanistic commitments to fixing the child or strengthening the child. At other times, they're animated by market logic that views students and families as valued customers who must be satisfied in order to protect the institution's brand and position within the marketplace. Penn Charter, Germantown Friends, they don't want a bunch of kids being truant, but they can say we're managing school refusal. So why was school refusal not available to Shayla Peoples and her mom? Why was the UCLS approach not used for other people who are simply called truant? Now, let me be clear. School refusal and truancy are distinctly different concepts among mental health experts. School refusal is not in the DSM-5, but it is viewed by mental health professionals as a symptom of other disorders. So school refusal is treated as a condition that requires mental health professionals. Let me pause for a minute. Think back to all y'all cousins and them in the 80s on crack, right? They were not treated as people with a medical condition. Your uncles and them, my uncles and them on heroin were not treated as people with medical conditions. They were treated as people who had character flaws. Think about how you think about in the popular imagination, because the pedagogy of blame is articulated not just in school, not just in public policy, but also in pop culture. Think New Jack City for y'all old enough. Think about Pookie the crackhead. Think about how the crackhead is constructed in the popular imagination versus the cokehead. When you think of the cokehead, you might think of a corporate attorney. You might think of somebody who has a bad habit, but still is a viable human being worthy of investment, care. You might even still have them do your taxes. But the crackhead is lascivious, hypersexual, dishonest, untrustworthy. The cokehead makes a bad choice. The crackhead is a bad person. And in a carceral society, where do you put bad people? Jail. The pedagogy of blame then becomes a framework for deciding who's worthy of investment and who isn't. Now, the distinction between truancy and school refusal is not inherently problematic. It's a useful distinction. But as these examples between Cherie Peoples and the example I just gave you demonstrate, the determination of whether somebody is truant or refusing school is often not the result of scientific inquiry or diagnostic testing or other ostensibly objective measures. Rather, it is highly subjective and arbitrary and directly shaped by the relations of power. So, in addressing school refusal, the Chicago schools recognize the unparalleled demands placed on students during COVID-19. Threat of illness, economic hardship, radical disruptions to the social, familial, and educational lives of students and families. Cool. While legitimate, these same concerns could easily be applied to many of the poor and minoritized families who are routinely charged with truancy. Cherie and Shayla Peoples, they ain't care about her health. More broadly, truancy laws ignore how such demands are perennially negotiated by vulnerable communities whose lives are routinely disrupted and unsettled due to various forms of precarity that existed long before the COVID-19 pandemic. That's what Gloria Ladson-Billings was trying to tell us after Hurricane Katrina. She said they're in the same condition, now they just wet. She was saying that the economic conditions of precarity have intensified and been magnified and maybe even become a spectacle. But the fundamental condition has always been there. And that's part of the legal apparatus. That's why the boogeyman of critical race theory became so important to use, and that's why Bill Tate and Gloria Ladson-Billings were so instrumental in helping us understand that, and Dr. Royal's doing that right now, because we have to think about these constructs in that way. I'm going to say one last thing, and then I promise I'm going to leave you all alone. Like any Negro preacher that don't really mean much. But I'm going to read it because I don't want to say it wrong. All of this ties back to an idea of reimagining schools, of reimagining what's possible for schools, of reimagining what's possible for all of us. But as I said at the beginning, that speaks to a crisis. This condition speaks to a crisis of imagination. We have to imagine not just new policies, but radically new approaches to those policies. We have to imagine radical new worlds. For most of us, the idea of that world is an impossible one. While we can wrap our minds around the notion of prison reform, the liberal project of producing more comfortable cages, abolition sits outside the reach of our moral and political imaginations. As a society, while we struggle to envision a social landscape on which the prison is not a central and immovable monument, this sense of impossibility is reflected in the questions we ask when confronted with an abolitionist vision. How can we exist without prisons? How will we protect the vulnerable? How should we deal with crime and violence? What must we do with the people currently inside of them? Now, these are not unimportant questions. These are very important questions, in fact. Freedom fighters from Paulo Freire to the Black Panther Party have taught us not to expect the people to embrace a radical project that neglects their most immediate concerns and most urgent needs. For both ethical and pragmatic purposes, the abolitionist and any radical worker cannot afford to dismiss vital matters like food, clothing, shelter, and safety as mundane or prosaic. How dare we challenge the people to pursue the marvelous if we are unwilling or unable to address the demands of the quotidian? For teachers, the demands of the right now are especially urgent. The current climate, which is marked by neoliberal obsessions with surveillance and competition and punitive accountability, has pushed educators into professional survival mode. And for students, this sense of desperation is compounded by the aggressive forces of poverty, of criminalization, and of violence. From this place of urgency, the work of prison abolition or any other manifestation of the radical imagination is understandably viewed as an extravagance. But our social ambitions cannot begin and end with the immediate or the pragmatic. As Christian theologian Howard Thurman compels us in The Growing Edge, we must never scale down our aspirations to the level of the facts in our present situation. Like most Christians, Thurman recognizes the scandal of the cross, where Jesus, a radical Palestinian Jew, is subjected to cruel and unusual punishment and an unjust death sentence by the Roman government because of his radical politics. They see it as a site of tragedy and death, but his analysis dares us not to linger in the space of death. Instead, Thurman points to the resurrection 3 days later as a reminder of the boundless possibilities for life that can emerge out of apparent impossibility. The power of Thurman's message is not limited to people of faith, though. Rather, he urges all of us to acknowledge the grim realities of the present without becoming hostage to them. As Jesus did not remain prisoner to the events of the cross, I'm going to say that again. As Jesus did not remain prisoner of the event of the cross, Thurman argues that we are not destined to be prisoners of the events of our individual or collective lives. As Jesus refused to let death have the last word, we cannot allow the limitations of the moment to foreclose on what is possible for the immediate and distant future. Instead, we must imagine and desperately pursue the impossible. But at this juncture in history, all of the evidence suggests that we can't. The statistics say that we can't. The referee journal article findings say that we're still pathological and we can't. The rising death toll says we can't. The election cycles say we can't. But the social justice commitment that we have to have as scholars has to transcend this moment. We can't be prisoner to this event. We can't be prisoner to this juncture in history. We can't be prisoner to this economic mode of production. We can't be prisoner to this power block. Instead, we must doggedly, tirelessly, unashamedly pursue the impossible. And if we do that, we can not only achieve abolition, we can achieve and birth more ambitious and radical freedom dreams than we could ever imagine. I want to thank you all for joining me. I appreciate you all. God bless you. Good.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Marc Lamont Hill again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. As a quick reminder, remember immediately following Q&A, we have a reception in room 113AB. And so we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please start working your way toward the microphone. As I am the timekeeper, I ask that you keep your questions brief, no soliloquies, just get to the question so we have more time for questions to flow through. Thank you.
Thank you.
How you
doing, my brother? Oh, thank you.
keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, my brother.
It's off. It's off. You're in media now. So where are the hopeful spaces in the media space, either in terms of particular stations, particular owners who will at least create space for discussion of what you're talking about, or where are the educational sites where such people can be grown, groomed, and encouraged?
I think the thing that I've been encouraged by is the lessons that we learned decades ago by students and other young people that were producing multimedia, multimodal digital projects. If you look at the work of people like Aletha Vasudevan, for example, and others, Dr. Valerie Kinlock, other folk who are producing these interesting spaces, this interesting work, or people who are looking in out-of-school spaces, people like Bianca Baldridge. And all of these people are telling us to begin with youth as a site and source of knowledge production. So 20 years ago, when I think about Valerie's book where she was did Harlem on My Mind, and these young people are narrating and talking about and counter-narrating gentrification. Now, as we are in the mode where everybody has a cell phone and lots of people have access to media-making technology, I'm finding that the educational spaces and the counter-narration spaces have expanded. So you can go on YouTube any day of the week and find people who engage in educational praxis. I have a program on YouTube I call Night School. It's on every night, Monday to Friday, and I use that as kind of a global classroom. It's a space for educational interventions. But folk who don't have access to our universities, people who, like Maisha Wynn talked about in her earlier work, get the dual degree, right? Where you go to the school, but you also go to the Black bookstore, right? Yeah. These out-of-school intellectual traditions, people like Carol Lee and Safisha Madhubuti, who talk about so what it means to engage Black vernacular traditions. All of these spaces are where you go. So to give you a concrete answer, I'm saying go to YouTube, but don't just look for the big names, find the everyday people who are doing interesting stuff. Support Black bookstores and Black intellectual traditions outside of formal schooling spaces. All of these things, I think, are spaces that are important, but we have a tendency, particularly in this conference, and in this division, I'm talking about Division G folk, because when I see Black folk, I use Division G and Black folk interchangeably sometimes. We tend to romanticize that stuff sometimes. Sometimes we keep producing study after study where it's really just different kids, and we're really just saying, look how cool these kids are. But what we have to do is interrogate those spaces and ask, what are the politics that are at play in those spaces? In what places are we replicating unhealthy masculinity? In what places are we advancing transphobic narratives? In what places are we reinforcing capitalist logics? In what spaces are we reinforcing carceral logics? So I'm saying look in those spaces, but also let's look at them with a critical eye. And as scholars, I think we have to do a better job of critiquing those spaces and not just saying, wow, look at how awesome, look at these kids resisting.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's on. Hey, how's it going? My name is Arsene Frederick Jr. I'm a third-year doctoral at Howard University, HU. That's right.
Oh, my gosh. My wife is also a Howardite, so I get that at least once a day.
That's right. You know it. But also shout out to all the HBCUs in here. It's HBCU love.
Yes.
So I want to start by saying, in the words of Deacon Tevin Dermod Campbell, can we talk? But I'm talking about a different.
But only for a minute.
Only for a minute, exactly. Only for a minute. To get to a place of utilizing a getting to a place of pedagogy that informs our language for abolition in education. I think there's a real battle in education right now, and the one I'm talking about is over language. So we talk about what I'm referring to as terms around marginalized, disadvantaged, underprivileged, underrepresented. The truth is these terms don't serve me. They don't. I don't think they serve us as Black African Americans.
Which prompted you to ask what?
Which prompted me to ask, how might we take this notion of abolition, when we talk about abolishing blame, and utilize it to give us a new language to discuss the material condition of, Black and brown communities, the human community. The truth is we are fighting for our lives out here, and we need to be able to say that. So I'm curious to hear a little bit.
I think that's right. I think, one, we have to engage in the kind of political education and critical media literacy, right? So we can actually say, look at these relations of power, look at these discourses, look at the language that we're using. Think about back with Ann Ferguson's work decades ago with Bad Boys, right? There's a way that we would sometimes label people, sometimes intentionally, like, they're going to jail. And then other ways where we would use more subtle things like at risk, right? Everybody's at risk. You walk down the street in Philly, you're at risk, right? But let's think about how we can reimagine this language to be more analytically specific, but also not to pathologize people purely from certain geographic locations, without neglecting the fact that some people legitimately do face a different kind of risk than others. Like, we also don't want to pretend that's not true. Right? So we need to have that conversation as scholars and reframe and recalibrate language, but we don't want to get, I think sometimes we get locked into that, because there can be a cottage industry and just rewriting terms, or I make a phrase and then I write an article and you write a different phrase and you publish that phrase and then I got to cite that phrase. And before you know it, we've spent a career citing and creating phrases but not actually making any significant interventions. And I think that the way to respond to that is to do that work, because we need rigorous intellectual traditions, but we also need practice and praxis. And I think that's where involving practitioners in the construction of this language, in the conversation about this language, becomes vital. So what does it mean for us as educators to do teacher research or scholar research, if that's the work we're doing in the field? What does it mean for our political education to include practitioners, right? But again, we also can't just romanticize the fact that because someone's on the ground that they write, right? As ethnographers, we talk about the emic and the edict. We don't just ignore the edict because of the emic, right? We don't just say because someone made sense of this context or this thing in this way that they have to have it right. Because all of our worldviews are informed by patriarchy. All of our worldviews are informed by white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to have a complex conversation about how that stuff works and how that stuff plays together. But I think the key is involving the stakeholders, and that's a thing that we've never done before. Not well. Not well.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right. So a few years ago, Congress lifted a long-standing ban on Pell Grants for people who are incarcerated. And since that time, we've seen a number of institutions of higher learning enter into the field of education in prison. So I'm wondering, one, if you can speak to just what you know about the effectiveness and the merits of providing education in prison. And then secondly, not to put you on the spot, but I think it's a legit question, have you yourself done any work with incarcerated individuals in terms of education? Thank you.
It's a great question. The answer to the second question is yes. For years, I was a member of the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and I would do direct work at SCI Green in terms of educational interventions. I don't do as much as I should, and I don't do anything right now inside of prisons, but I'm open to it now that I've moved to the City University of New York. They have some relationships there. Shout out to CUNY. That's right. CUNY has those relationships inside of prisons in a way that Temple didn't. That's not no shade on Temple, just those relationships just weren't there. But my work with the PPS, the Pennsylvania Prison Society, I did that for about 8 years. That's actually that's not how I connected with Mumia Abu-Jamal, but that's how we started to work together, was through PPS. And I worked with other brothers on death row doing educational stuff. So that's been there, but not nearly at the level that it should be. To your first question, the challenge for abolitionists is always, if the goal is to create a world without a prison industrial complex, what role do reforms play in making the world believe that prisons are reformable? That's always the central ethical and moral tension and contradiction. Because if I keep coming up with great programs and libraries and this and that and improve the lunchroom, and then at some point people say, well, all we need to do is make prisons better, because it makes it seem as if the problem with prisons is how they're run rather than prison as an idea itself. But that's easy to say when you're not in prison. I'm gonna tell you a quick story. Mumia Abu-Jamal was on death row for almost 30 years. We fought, we organized. I wasn't at the front of the line. I was nowhere near the front of the line. Shout out to Pam Africa. Shout out to all the people who made the international movement happen. But Mumia got off of death row maybe 10 years ago now, maybe 13 years ago now. And when Mumia got off death row, we were celebrating, we were hugging, we were happy. I had known him for years. We had written a book together at this point. And people were like, we did it. And then I remember some liberals came in. I won't say their race, because their whiteness isn't important. But they came in and said, what are you guys doing? Like, what are you celebrating? Like, he's still on death row. This is not a victory. You're normalizing and reifying the carceral system. This is not a victory. This might even be a loss. So I started feeling bad for feeling good. And then Mumia called me about a week later. And I said, yo, man, I was up here celebrating. I was happy you got off death row. And some cats broke it down, and they explained to me why it wasn't even a victory. You know what Mumia said? Shit. He said, anybody who said that ain't never been on death row. He said, because of the work y'all did, I can meet you in person, but more importantly, I can kiss my wife. She's now passed away, rest in peace, Wadia. I can kiss my wife. I can hug my children. I can go in general population. I'm no longer in a cage, 23-1. My life is materially better from this. I don't know what they talking about. To put that in a more conceptual context or theoretical context, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talked about the difference between reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms. We can have reforms. We cannot be abstract theoreticians that say that we're only going to do radical this and nothing else, because when you do that, you deny condoms to people who could no longer get HIV/AIDS if they were there. You give people access to healthy food so that they don't die from preventable illnesses. They can get medical treatment. So we want reforms. We want changes, but they can't be changes that keep us in a place of believing that the system as it is can stand tall. And so education becomes a key area where we struggle with that question. Do we want to educate people in prison? Hell yeah. Allowing Pell Grants was a critical maneuver. It makes you less likely to go back. Giving people access to makes it less likely to go back, even though right now they're trying to shrink the prison libraries and create a very short list of permissible books in schools. They tried that right here in Pennsylvania. We fought, we won, but they gave us a list of 100 books you could read. We fought because they need to have access to greater ideas. Lifting the Pell Grant is key. Getting more educational intervention is key. Us, myself included, doing more inside of the prisons is key. We have to do that work. But please, family, don't believe that because we're doing that work that somehow we're let off the hook. That we can have less ambitious freedom dreams. That we can scale down our aspirations, as Thurman said, to the events that are our present situation. No, we're not going to be prisoner of the event. We're going to be prisoner of nothing. With regard to our political imagination, we're going to imagine something else. I'm going to take these two questions real fast, and then we got to roll.
I'll be fast. Regarding stakeholders, MSNBC last night announced that the Tennessee legislature decided that they're going to give guns to teachers. The parents complain, the teachers complain, the police complain. Everybody's complaining, and Monday they're going to take the vote. And by the way, it's the parents that were in the audience and whatever, they had the sheriffs move them out of this legislation, out of the building, so they didn't have to hear these people complain about the fact they did not want this particular new law. And so that's in terms of, you're talking about people going to prison, and you know who's going to get killed. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, part of a carceral logic is believing that we can punish our way, control our way, and even kill our way to safety and peace. It's kind of an Orwellian logic, right? And you're right. Arming teachers is a terrible idea. I didn't even want to get y'all TI-84s. You know what I mean? Like, they didn't know what they was doing with them. Now you give them a 9mm? Like, no. Right? And the same logics that make you over-suspend people are the same logics that make you pull that gun out faster for one student versus another. It's a terrifying idea. And we also know that in moments of real crisis, a lot of times people get their guns taken from them. It actually just doesn't work. Forget the moral incompetence of this kind of a legislator who comes up with this kind of idea. Forget the fact that it's dangerous as hell. It doesn't work. But this is, in many ways, a kind of right-wing virtue signal that we're seeing all around the country. They're trying to arm teachers. They're trying to ban books. They're trying to silence history. They're trying to do something that I refer to in another book I'm working on right now called Caging the American Mind. They're trying to limit how we imagine freedom, how we can think, and what we can do. Stage one is to erase history, to challenge history. You see the bans on 1619, the fights on critical race theory, all this stuff. The next thing they want to do is create a moral and intellectual panic. We're losing the country. In the 80s, it was Alan Bloom and E.D. Hirsch with cultural literacy. Oh my God. We're losing our morals, and we're going to lose to Russia because no one knows what a fortnight is. Right? Then after they do that, they ban the books. They just take them from you. And then the last stage they do is they criminalize it. Look at the Stop Woke Act in Florida. They begin to use legislation as a response, first civil and then criminal, to respond to any exercise of freedom. That's what's happening right now. And the guns are just an ally to those stages. And that's what it is. All right, y'all, there's one more question right here.
Good evening.
Is that Dr. Greg Seaton in the back? Oh my God, it is, shout out to you, Dr. Greg Seaton, for coming in here. All right, y'all, my last question.
Good evening. I stand before you as a career educator, a first-year doctoral student at Teachers College, and a woman impacted by familial incarceration. As an educator, you mentioned that over 2 million people are incarcerated in the United States.
Yeah.
I have deep concern for their children impacted by the incarceration, whom I have undertaken to educate. What things can be done, and I'm coming to you as a former New York City DOE teacher, what things can be done to support the children impacted by incarceration?
One thing is, and I think about the work of Vivian Gadsden, who in the 90s now was doing work with fathers reading, particularly fathers reading to their kids in prison. So the underlying logic of that was recidivism will be lower and student well-being will be higher if there are connections between those children and the incarcerated people. So one thing we have to do is actually physically get them there. And the reason why that's so challenging is because the way that state prison systems work is that when you commit a crime in Philly or you commit a crime in Pittsburgh, the prison you in, very rarely is that prison that you go to going to be anywhere near. You might be lucky and get to Graterford, but most likely you're going to be out in SCI this or SCI that 3, 4, 5, 6 hours away. And it's designed that way to keep you from your people, and then you got to call them on the phone, and they make phone calls $5 a minute. So again, this is the corporatization of everything. So we have to, the first thing we need to do is invest in networks of transportation and connection that allow people to physically be near their families and also talk to their families. Now, they have tablets and other technologies that make that easier now, but again, they often don't those things are underfunded. So we need to do that. The other thing we need to do is deal with the psychological dimensions of incarceration and separation. So that means that any school that has a counseling team, and again, schools often don't have counseling teams. We did a session the other day where somebody told me they're the only counselor out of 1,000 people, when the National Association says there should be 1 in 250, and ideally 1 to 50, the ratio between counselors and students. But you go to a school in West Philly, you might have 5,000 to 1, 2,000 to 1, 1,000 to 1. So I understand it's a capacity issue, but we have to invest in that. There's not a school in Philadelphia that doesn't have an issue with students who are separated from their mothers and fathers because of incarceration. Ain't one. So we should have departments, we should have personnel exclusively devoted to making sure that we're dealing with the psychosocial needs of those children at the same time that we're connecting with them. And the other thing we have to do, and I love the new array of, I'm speaking now as a kind of former literacy scholar, is thinking about the type of children's books we read, the type of young adult literature we have. How do they deal with the question of incarceration? How do they deal with the humanity of the incarcerated? Because if we continue to deal with it the way we have, then people read these books and they see the absence and they feel the absence and they think their mothers and their fathers aren't worth anything. Right. We have to help them reimagine who their parents are. So that we have to. That would be my answer. Anyway, everybody, thank you. God bless you. Good night.